Started. Welcome to the fourth day of class. So today we're going to be learning about jQuery, which is a JavaScript library. And jQuery gives us a lot of syntactic conveniences on top of the native DOM manipulation methods. So it makes it a little bit easier to do some of the stuff that we've been doing in class today. And on top of being easier to write out, it also takes care of a lot of uncertainty that you might encounter out in the world in different types of environments. So different browsers, mobile versus desktop. It kind of takes care of all that behind the scenes for you. So you just have one interface that you work with regardless of what browser or environment you're building a website or application for. So I will go ahead and share my screen and get started. All right, so what is jQuery? It's a JavaScript library that provides convenient syntax for traversing and manipulating the DOM. That's, once again, the document object model. And it hides the complexity of coding around browser inconsistency. It's also one of the largest open source projects on the internet. I'm actually going to take a slight detour to talk about what open source is for people that may not know. Open source is the idea that lots of people contribute on a project where the code is completely open to everyone. There's usually so jQuery and a lot of open source projects on the internet are managed through GitHub, which we'll be learning about tomorrow. And there's usually an owner or several owners of an organization. So for instance, jQuery, there's an organization of people that manages any contributions to the open source project. So let's say I find an error in jQuery or something that I think could be improved. I might go online and I will get my own copy of jQuery and I'll make some changes to that original code. And then I essentially ask them to add those contributions to the original source of jQuery, and they have control to decide whether they do that or not. But outside of that, if they don't want to take my contributions, I can take that copy of jQuery, and because it's open source, I can go start working on like a different copy of jQuery and host it and allow people to download my copy of jQuery. I'll get a little bit more into open source when we talk about GitHub tomorrow, but it is a lot of the technologies you encounter are going to be open source, and it's a great way to get experience before you have a job or build experience while you are in the workplace, is to find an open source project that you feel like you're passionate about or really interested in and start contributing to it. Cool. So back to jQuery. We can use jQuery to traverse and select DOM nodes, to manipulate DOM nodes, so add and remove CSS classes, add and remove HTML elements and text, and animate elements on the page. So CSS has an animation library, and jQuery uses those CSS animations and gives you, again, some syntactical conveniences for creating on-the-fly CSS animations. It also allows us to listen for and respond to user actions, and we'll get more in depth into that next Tuesday, I believe, when we talk about events. Might be later in the week, but it'll be sometime next week. And it also allows us to communicate with APIs and servers. So essentially what it allows us to do is go talk to other places on the web and ask them for information. So let's say a user enters their location and we're going to give them a Google map with all of the restaurants around their house. We might use jQuery to go ask Google for that Google map and all of the information about the restaurants. And that piece, communicating with other parts of the web, we'll get into that in week 3. All right. So let's start to look at how jQuery works. In the last slide, I was talking about DOM nodes. So a node is going to be any element in the HTML document, and this includes both the actual, like this H3 with the ID of title. It will include both the H3, but also the text inside of that H3 tag is a separate child node of the document object model of that H3. So it's not super important yet to understand what a node is and how these nodes are related. Just know that a node is some unit of the HTML document that you can grab with jQuery and start to work with. Cool. So on the right, we have an HTML document. On the left, we have what that would look like. All right. So this is jQuery. You have the $sign. So jQuery is a big library, but it's all stored on the page. Like when you put the jQuery library on your page, you're able to access it with the $sign. And then whatever you pass in between those parentheses is going to be a node that you're selecting. And I think I'm going to jump over to my browser console to show how I construct this. So I've created just a test HTML document, and I've imported jQuery, and I'll get into more detail about how to do that part at the end of the lesson. And I've also got some styles that I've connected to the page. So it's just some predefined CSS styles that I'm going to make use of. But for the time being, I'm going to use jQuery to grab different elements on the page. So right now, let's grab this H5, because I think it's the only H5 on the page. So I'm going to type my $sign, and then between the parentheses, if I'm just targeting an HTML tag, I place the name of that tag between quotation marks. And now I'm going to hit enter to run that command, and you'll see that it returns to me that HTML node. And it's between brackets, so these are all going to come back in what's called an array. An array is something we'll get a little bit more into again next week, but just if you're wondering what those square brackets are, that's why they're there. And you'll notice if we target an element that there are multiple instances of, so we've got several list elements on the page. So if I grab all of the list elements, they're going to be returned as a list of comma-separated nodes inside those square brackets. All right. So yeah, as you see, if I grab list elements, it returns all the list elements. I can also target classes and IDs, just like we've been doing with the native DOM methods. So we have a class of container on the page. So if I say jQuery.container, it's going to give me back every element with a class of container. If I say jQuery #title, it's going to give me back the element that has the ID of title. And another important thing to note is that if you grab a node that has child nodes, so looking at this div with the class of container, the entire rest of the page is contained inside of that div. So everything inside of that div is considered to be a child node of the div with the class of container. So when we target that div using jQuery, it's actually giving us back all of the child nodes of the div as well as that div. If we, let's say that, well, I'll go into a little bit more detail about how adding class and manipulating those nodes works with relation to the children. But before I go into actually doing stuff, are there any questions about how we target DOM nodes using jQuery? Does each node take up one spot in the array? Oh, okay, that's a good question. In the instance of the list elements, because each of these list elements are not children of one another, like they're siblings, they do each take up one spot in the array. However, when we target the container node that has a bunch of children, this is actually only taking up one spot in the array. And those children are existing inside of this div node as subnodes. Does that make sense, Patrick? Cool. Alrighty. So I will continue moving. Let's see. Okay. So yeah, now we can watch what we're grabbing on the HTML as we walk through those commands. So when we target container, it targets the whole page. Title targets that title H3. We can use any valid CSS selector. So for instance, if we ran jQuery ul space li, we're going to target all li elements that are children of a ul element. And we can also target even and odd elements in the way that we would with CSS. One thing to note, and this will make more sense when we get to arrays, is that when we have these 4 elements and they're returned in the array, JavaScript in general and jQuery start counting at 0. So this element that says first is actually will be seen as like the 0 element. The second one will be seen as the first element. The third will be seen as the second element. And the fourth will be seen as the third element. Similar to the way the curriculum app is structured, where we have week 0, week 1, week 2, week 3. So those are something to note if you are using the even and odd selectors. All right, so now let's actually try manipulating some of these DOM nodes. We'll imagine that we have some predefined CSS styles to work with. So let's start by adding a div with the class of black border to the body tag. Notice we've placed the div tag between quotations. In jQuery, all of your HTML has to be between strings in the same way that we've been doing with the native DOM methods. So I've targeted the body tag, and then I used the append method to add a div with a class of black border that says hello world to the body element. We can also, aside from adding HTML to the page, we can add and remove classes. So I'm gonna target this div with the class of black border, and I'm going to remove the class of black border. Notice when we say add class or remove class, we can target that class without adding the dot, because since we've used the class keyword, jQuery knows that that's what we're looking for. All right, so now we're going to add that class back in using add class. So whenever we go and grab a DOM node using the jQuery selector, so we say $, we call the parentheses, and we pass in whatever DOM node we're looking for, we're wrapping that node in a bunch of functionality that jQuery gives us. And we have access to that functionality after the parentheses by saying dot, and then calling whatever method we want on that jQuery node that we've created. So that's why after we say $div, we can say dot add class, or we could say dot append, or dot remove class. So yeah, we access this functionality by using a period after the parentheses, as so $dot do something. So if the DOM is like a computer, jQuery is adding extra buttons so it's easier to use that computer and access different parts of the functionality. All right, so we're going to remove the class black border again. And we'll add another class called primary. Again, you have to imagine that we have some CSS behind the scenes. So, it looks like this class of primary has a background color of blue and a border color of orange and a text color of white. And it might have a certain font size or a certain width and height for that div. And since we've predefined it in our CSS, we can just add that class onto there, and it will change our div accordingly. Aside from add class and remove class, we can also use toggle class. Toggle class is, for instance, with this div, it had the class of primary. When we call toggle class, it removes class. But if we called toggle class again, it would add that class back on. And then if we called toggle class one more time, it would remove it. All right, so now we'll add the black border class back in. And now let's try changing the text inside of the div. We target the div and we call the .text method, and then we can pass in whatever string of text we'd like to change. So we can also store HTML strings, so the stringified HTML, as a variable in our JavaScript. And you've probably seen this using the native DOM methods and the exercises earlier this week. And then when we target the div and we want to append the string that we've just created, we can just pass in that variable. We don't have to actually write all of the HTML into the parentheses because we've stored it as a variable. So just to take note, you can mix JavaScript and jQuery. jQuery is a JavaScript library, so all JavaScript, all valid JavaScript syntax is going to be valid in the context of jQuery. Cool. So there's different ways to do the same things in jQuery. And there's no right or wrong or better way a lot of the time. It's more so just a stylistic preference. So for instance, when we call div.append HTML string, what happened behind the scenes is that it added this tiny box to the bottom of the div. We can do the same thing, except in the first instance, we can pass in HTML string, and we can say append that HTML string to the div. So it did the same thing, but we just turned the order of things we're passing in around. You can also use prepend to add things to the beginning of something. Let's see, I think this should actually say div.prepend HTML string instead of another div. But the point is that you use prepend to add things to the top of an HTML element rather than the bottom. And then similarly to append and append to. Oh. If you use prepend to, you'll be able to do the same thing where you could pass in HTML string and you could append it to the div. You can also, instead of changing the text content of an element, you can change the whole HTML content of that element using the .html method. So we say div.html string, and we replace everything that was in there with just our single tiny box. You can also remove elements from the page using either .detach or .remove. All right, so we've lost our div. We're going to add it back on there, but this time we're going to mix up some JavaScript and jQuery. So we create a variable called tinybox with a class of tiny. It's going to look like what we had before. And then we create a counter variable, I. and we create a while loop while I is less than 5. For each time this this loop runs, we will append the tiny box to our HTML body. And you can see as the counter increases, it's just going to add it each time. So when you add jQuery to your HTML page, since you're targeting elements in the HTML, you have to wait until the HTML loads to be able to access some of those elements. And there's 2 ways of doing this. You can either have your jQuery script tag at the very end of your body, so it'll be the last thing before you close your HTML body tag, or you can wrap your jQuery code in another jQuery method called document.ready. And what this does is when the document is done loading, it says, okay, now run all of this jQuery that I have inside the document.ready. And it would look like this. You'd have document.ready, and you have curly braces, and then everything, you could write all of your jQuery between those curly braces. All right, so one last thing. In order to use jQuery, you're going to need to include it as a script tag in your HTML document, so you have access to the jQuery library. The most common way to do this is to use a CDN link that stands for Content Distribution Network. So this is just a link that exists out on the internet, and it's essentially a server that has jQuery loaded onto it. And when you import that script, when you include this script link on your page, when the page loads, it goes and asks that server for the jQuery library, and the server gives it to it and then loads it on your page. You can also download the source code and then have jQuery as a library inside of your project's inside of the directory that you're working in. And then you would do a similar thing where you'd have script source equals, but then instead of pointing to somewhere out online, you would be pointing to wherever that jQuery file is on your computer. And the curriculum has instructions on how to set this up, but don't forget to do the step because you'll be writing jQuery and getting errors like it'll essentially tell you it doesn't know what the $sign is. And if that's the case, you've probably forgotten to include jQuery. Cool. So that's the end of the presentation. I do want to kind of show you how to find that link. So I'm going to go to google.com. I'm going to type in jQuery CDN. And you'll notice that on jQuery, the jQuery website, they have their own CDN. Let's see. So when you're in production, you'll want to use the minified version. That means they've compressed it really densely so that it looks like something, the computer can read it, but obviously a human wouldn't be able to read this. This is what it looks like when it's not compressed. While you're starting to work with it, you're welcome to use the uncompressed version so that if you do want to look at the source code and see what it looks like on the inside, you can. But that is what the minified version is for production environments where people want it to run a little bit faster. So the way to grab it from here would be to open up one of those in a tab, and then you could just include that link in your script tag. I prefer to use the link from the Google Developers Library. Where is jQuery? All right, cool. So you'll see they have a section for jQuery, 2.x. That means it's whatever the most current version of jQuery 2 is. You'll notice that it's 2.2.2. So you can grab this whole script tag and you can go over to your HTML document I'm going to get rid of what I had before, and you can just copy and paste that script tag into your HTML. And now, when I load this test HTML on the page, you'll see I have access to jQuery. All right. So, are there any questions? Alrighty. Well, if we don't have any questions, then I'll go ahead and let everyone go to break off into groups and start working. So we will split into new groups today, and remember to update to mark on the pair checklist who you're pairing with. Try to pair with someone that you haven't paired with before. And also, once you set up your Google Hangouts and your Flutelets, please update those links on the whiteboard. And then we will meet back. We'll meet back 10 minutes before class ends. I've got a few announcements, and then we'll just wrap up. Alrighty, I'll see you all in a little bit.